In 1996, a little-known author named G.R.R Martin released his first novel in 13 years. He called this one A Game of Thrones, and the series that it was a part of, A Song of Ice and Fire.
One day, the first chapter of Game of Thrones came to me. The scene where they find the direwolf pups in the summer snows.
He hoped that this novel would be received better than his last, a book called Armageddon's Rag, which released in 1983 and was a financial failure, despite positive reviews. It had been that failure that had turned him away from novels and more towards television scripts. In the television world, he wrote episodes for Twilight Zone and the Beauty and the Beast television show, among other things. Thankfully for George, A Game of Thrones sold well. It wasn't an immediate blockbuster hit, because that wouldn't happen until the HBO show, but the series still sold well over 12 million copies by 2011, landing it in a comfortable spot among other science fiction and fantasy authors like Timothy Zahn of Thrawn fame or Yoshika Tanaka of Legend of the Galactic Heroes acclaim. Not that I'm biased or anything, but I suggest you check that latter one out. The first 3 books came out on a regular schedule, once every 2 years. Game in 1996, Clash in 98, and Storm in 2000. But problems began to appear when in 2002, there was no new book. 2003 came and went, 2004 flew by, and it wouldn't be until 2005 that Feast for Crows was released. This 5-year gap was the first warning sign of what was to come. Now, 5 years isn't a horrible time to wait. Plenty of authors take years between books. It's nothing novel. The problem was, A Dance with Dragons also didn't take 2 years. Instead, it took 6, eventually releasing in 2011, a few months before the first season of the television show. Dance and Feast had been far more difficult for George, as evident by the increasing weight between them, but also on his blog. He complained many times about Dance being a real problem of a novel to finish. It does make sense that these latter novels would be difficult to finish if you really stop and think about it. The books have problems to solve, and they aren't easy ones. Many POV characters need to meet up and interact, they have tons of information to share between them, and this all has to be juggled on a sensible timeline. The story also has to pick up its pacing dramatically, tons of plot lines have to be resolved in the coming 2 novels, and they aren't small ones either. The others, Jon Snow's parentage, Daenerys' invasion of Westeros, Aegon's invasion of Westeros, whatever the hell Bloodraven is up to, whatever the hell Littlefinger is up to, whatever Dorne is up to, it starts to become clear why this book has taken so long. There are too many plot lines and not enough time. Made even worse is that George not only slowed down the pacing with chapters dedicated to traveling and characters getting sidetracked, he also introduced new plot lines and POVs in the 5th book of a 7-book series. In fairness, many of these are good plot lines and POVs, especially John Connington, but it's still quite a conundrum that he's made for himself, one that's still ongoing. But let's take a step back for a moment. This is a video about the history of Winds of Winter, so we need to go all the way back to 2011 when Dance was first released. It's here that we get our first quote about the Winds of Winter, when George is asked the general timeline of the next novel. Hopefully the last 2 books will go a little quicker than this one has, but that doesn't mean they're going to be quick. Realistically, it's going to take me 3 years to finish the next one at a good pace. I hope it doesn't take me 6 years, like the last one has. Later in July, George said he wouldn't be writing for the rest of 2011, and admits that he's bad at making predictions on when his next book will be released. There's an element of fans who don't seem to realize I'm making estimates. I've been repeatedly guilty of an excess of optimism. Probably the truest thing George has ever said. So George didn't write for the rest of 2011, which was about 6 months. But it's here we should discuss another element of Winds before we proceed to 2012. Cut material from Dance. Originally, Dance and Feast were one book, but as that would have been far too large to reasonably publish, the books were split in 2. Dance covers different characters than Feast, and it's also larger, but the point is, Dance itself grew too large, and several of its chapters were cut and moved to Winds. By 2010, we know that at least 5 chapters were removed from Dance and given to Winds. Specifically, 2 Arianne chapters, 1 Sansa chapter, 1 Arya chapter, and 1 Aeron chapter. With George saying that because of this, it would seem that he had already written 100 pages of Winds. And we should keep in mind that when he says that, he doesn't mean partially written chapters, usually. When George talks about page numbers, he tends to only talk about stuff he considers complete. The only exception to that rule is when he specifically singles out partially written work, something he does do from time to time. But usually, he's only talking about work that he feels is complete. Though, having said that, nobody should be that surprised if or ever Winds comes out that many of those sample chapters released over the years are quite different from what they originally were. But at this point, many of those chapters are at least 10 years old, or at least that's how old they were when they were released. Some of them could have been written 15 years ago. If that sounds crazy to you, you should know that parts of John 1 from Dance were written in 2001, 10 years before Dance was released. Tangents aside, by 2011, George felt that he had 100 completed pages of Winds, and who knows how much partially completed stuff. Speaking of sample chapters, there are at least 11, though one of those has no transcript. I'll get to it. One would release in 2011, that being the Theon chapter in which Arnulf Karstark's planned treachery is thwarted. It also has fake Arya, i.e. Jane Poole, being sent to the Wall, and Theon about to be executed, apparently under a weirwood tree. From here on, I'll mention the sample chapters by release, as of course they are a part of the Winds of Winter history, and the title, it does say complete. 2012. It's a new year and things are still looking hopeful. George gives an interview that April, but no new information is released. He confirms we learn more about the others, and the book opens with at least 2 battles, things that are pretty obvious if you read Dance with Dragons. He does specify that the 2 battles we'll be seeing are the Battle of Ice and the Battle of Marine. Interestingly enough, he doesn't mention the Battle of Blood or Steel. In October, he conducts another interview. In this one, he says that he won't be publishing the book in 2012 or 2013, but he does have over 400 pages done, and 2014 is a possibility. This year, we also get 2 more sample chapters. These aren't official, but instead read by George at conventions. The 2 for 2012 are Tyrion and Victarion. No transcript exists for Tyrion's, but we know that he plays Syvast with Brown Ben Plum in it while attempting to convince him to return to Dany's side. Then at the very end, the Ironborn arrive in their flying dragon banners. In connection with Tyrion's chapter, the Victarion one is right before the Battle of Marine. He's examining that horn that supposedly binds dragons, and then he tells a member of the crew to blow it when the time is right, knowing full well whoever blows it dies. The rest of 2012, at least for Winds of Winter news, is quiet, but the second season of A Game of Thrones comes out. Surely the books will be done before the show, right? 2013 brings us not 1, not 2, but 3 sample chapters. First is Arianne 1, which George released on his website. This chapter features Arianne and her companions traveling to meet Aegon Targaryen. Along the way, she ponders on her past, and then later sups at Ghost Hill. The chapter ends on them wondering if Dany has any madness in her. Next was a Barristan chapter read at a convention. Now I should point out that this one is further ahead in terms of story than the second Barristan chapter, which released later in 2013. The only reason I'm bringing this up first is because this chapter was read months before that second sample chapter, but technically this would be considered Barristan 2. This chapter begins with the Battle of Marine and ends with Barristan noticing the Ironborn fleet destroying the Voluntees fleet. The third chapter, which is Barristan 2, was released in the back of the American mass market paperback edition of A Dance with Dragons. This chapter is Barristan right before the Battle of Marine, where he's riding through the city atop Dany's horse. As the chapter ends, he gives a speech, dons his helmet, and rides into battle. In terms of Winds of Winter news, during the Season 3 premiere of Game of Thrones, George would claim the book is 1/4 done.
Well, proportionally, how many pages into book 6 are you?
I don't know. I haven't really counted. Maybe I'm about a quarter of the way done or something like that.
2014 is here. Let's talk about those sample chapters again. This time it's 2, a Tyrion one and an Arya one. The Tyrion one is technically Tyrion 1, as it was the first Tyrion chapter released publicly, but in actuality it's the second, if we count the Tyrion chapter George read 2 years before. This one takes place during the Battle of Marine. During it, Tyrion reflects on the Battle of the Green Fork while Penny helps him with his armor. Later, a messenger arrives and recognizes that Tyrion was a former slave. He orders the second sons to give him back, and Jorah kills him. Afterwards, Brown Ben Plum switches back to Dany's side. Mercy is next, and it's an Arya chapter. In it, she finds Ralph the Sweetling, one of the Mountain's men who Arya has wanted dead since he killed Lamy. He's in Bravos as Harry Swift's guard, who is himself there to negotiate with the Iron Bank. Arya spots Ralph and persuades him to return to her room. There she kills him and dumps his body in the canals. In the summer of 2014, George would give an interview with Entertainment Weekly, where he spoke candidly about Winds. Once again, he confirmed the book would start with 2 major battles, not super surprising for those who read the sample chapters. He goes on to confirm that there'll be more deaths, betrayals, and marriages, and that the Dothraki will re-enter the story in a, quote, big way. Lastly, and most worrying, is the question about Dany and Tyrion. The interviewer asks George about their first interaction, that meeting that so many fans have been wanting, and this is his response. Well, Tyrion and Dany will intersect in a way, but for much of the book they're still apart. They actually have quite large roles to play here. Tyrion's decided that he'd actually like to live, for one thing, which he wasn't entirely sure of during the last book. And now he's working towards that end, if he can survive the battle that's breaking out all around him. And Dany has embraced her heritage as a Targaryen and embraced the Targaryen words, so they're both coming home. Tyrion and Dany spending most of the penultimate book of the series apart is not a promising sign for those who are already worried about the glacial pace of the past 2 books. Anyway, to close out 2014, let's talk about the 12 Days of Westeros. On the first day, House Tully came bearing gifts. Hashtag 12 Days of Westeros. Now obviously this was a play on the 12 Days of Christmas song, but what got people so fired up was that since it started on the 9th, it would end on the 21st, which is the first day of winter for the Northern Hemisphere. What better day to announce the winds of winter than on the first day of winter? Naturally, this took the community by storm, with many excitedly predicting that Winds would soon have a release date. Of course, we all know how well that ended. Within 2 days, George's official account and Elio and Linda, 2 prominent members of the community, both posted that this was not a Winds of Winter announcement, and instead just some holiday fun. George himself even weighed in on his own blog and made it clear that he doesn't play games with news on books. There will be no codes or hidden meanings, and instead he would just announce the book when it was done. With that, we can end 2014 on a decidedly sour note. Hopefully 2015 will be better. To start off 2015, let's first start with the sample chapters. There's only one this year, a Sansa chapter called Elaine. In this chapter, one can see Sansa becoming more and more like Littlefinger. She's gaining a more political mind, if you will, becoming more clever, more Machiavellian. She also suggests that Robert Arryn receives guards, who are to be called the Brotherhood of Winged Knights. These members will be selected in a tourney that is about to take place. Mad Mouse, or Sir Shadrick, is also there too. He was last seen in A Feast for Crows looking for Sansa for the reward and a return to status. 2015, though, is not known for the Elaine sample chapter. Instead, it's known as the year in which George really thought he could finish Winds. In March, George would post to his blog saying that he wouldn't be attending Worldcon or Comic-Con so that he could focus solely on Winds of Winter. Obviously, this statement generated a lot of discussion online. If he wasn't attending conventions this year, perhaps he thought he could finish Winds in 2015. While the 4-year wait seemed optimistic, the first 3 had been released every 2 years, so it was possible. A month later, more good news appeared. In an interview, George said he was attempting to release Winds before the 6th season of A Game of Thrones, which would air spring of 2016, more specifically April of that year. This Entertainment Weekly interview came out April of 2015, so at this point, George felt that Winds of Winter could be out within 12 months. 2015 came and went, and the book did not come out. In January of 2016, George released a rather depressing blog. This is what it said. The Winds of Winter is not finished. Believe me, it gives me no pleasure to type those words. You're disappointed and you're not alone. My editors and publishers are disappointed. HBO is disappointed. My agents and foreign publishers and translators are disappointed. But no one could be possibly more disappointed than me. For months now, I have wanted nothing so much as to be able to say I have completed and delivered The Winds of Winter on or before the last day of 2015. But the book's not done. Yes, there's a lot written, hundreds of pages, dozens of chapters. But there's also a lot still left to write. I am months away still, and that's if the writing goes well. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. We all wanted Book 6 of A Song of Ice and Fire to come out before Season 6 of the HBO show aired. Assuming the show would return in early April, that meant The Winds of Winter had to be published before the end of March at the latest. For that to happen, my publishers told me they would need the completed manuscript before the end of October. That seemed very doable to me. So there was the first deadline, Halloween. Unfortunately, the writing did not go as fast or as well as I would have liked. Sometimes the writing goes well, and sometimes it doesn't. And that was true for me even when I was in my 20s. And as spring turned to summer, I was having more bad days than good ones. Around about August, I had to face facts. I was not going to be done by Halloween. I cannot tell you how deeply that realization depressed me. The book is not done, not delivered. No words can change that. I tried, I promise you. I failed. I blew the Halloween deadline, and now I've blown the end of the year deadline. And that almost certainly means that no, The Winds of Winter will not be published before the 6th season of A Game of Thrones premieres in April. Even as late as my birthday and our big Emmy win, I still thought I could do it, but the days and weeks flew by faster than the pile of pages grew. And as I often do, I grew unhappy with some of the choices I'd made and began to revise. Suddenly it was October, and then November. And the suspicion grew that I would not make it after all. A gloom set in. And I found myself struggling even more. The fewer the days, the greater the stress, and the slower the pace of my writing became. Of all the news about Winds of Winter over these long years, this to me remains the most depressing but also strangest of the bunch. Why did George really feel, that in early 2015 he could finish the book in only a few months? One really has to wonder what must have happened. Of course, George is bad with deadlines, he admits this in the very blog I've been reading from, but still, why was he so confident that it could release before Game of Thrones Season 6? Obviously, he hit some sort of roadblock, but what was it in particular? Some have pointed out that it could have been the mess in the north. All these POV characters and this big battle and Jon having to be revived, it's sort of a mess. Not to mention the problem in the east, which is Dany. Dany has to get to Westeros by the end of the book. The pacing has to be increased, and I really do think that's been a huge problem for George. Regardless, 2015 can be remembered as the last year in which George was extremely confident about Winds of Winter coming out soon. 2016. Let's begin with the sample chapters. These are the last two ever released. First is Arianne 2. Like Arianne 1, it's traveling. Then we have Forsaken, which is one of the more beloved of the sample chapters, and honestly, it's not surprising. This is one of the best chapters in the series, period. And while I recommend you read every sample chapter, at the very least, read this one. Forsaken is about Aeron Greyjoy. He's locked away in a dungeon where Euron forces him to drink Shade of the Evening, and he hallucinates some of the coldest imagery in the series, including gods impaled on the Iron Throne. He's later transported to a second dungeon where he once again has visions, and then the chapter ends with Euron decked out in Valyrian steel armor and Aeron tied to the prow of Euron's flagship, the Silence. As I said earlier, these are probably the last sample chapters ever to be released. When George was questioned if he would ever release more, he said, "I may give readings at upcoming conventions, but they will probably be of chapters I've read before at other conventions. There comes a point when you're simply putting too much of the book out there. It was not such a problem before the internet, but now everything I read gets transcribed and posted and leaked all over the world. So, that's all for 2016. Let's move on to next year." In July, George once again stated he was focusing most of his efforts on Winds and wouldn't be writing any episodes of television shows until Winds was done. Remember that Fire and Blood would come out the next year. Of course, in all fairness, it wasn't a television show, but it was still work. And I would wager that writing one episode of a television show is less work than an entire 700-plus page book, but hey, I digress.
George R.R. Martin, you better be working on that new book.
I am!
The same month, we would get even more news when George once again post to his blog and say this. And yes, I know you all want to know about the Winds of Winter too. I've seen some truly weird reports about Winds of Winter on the internet of late, by journalists who make their stories up out of the whole cloth. I don't know which story is more absurd, the one that says the book is finished and I've been sitting on it for some nefarious reason, or the one that says I have no pages. Both reports are equally false and equally moronic. I am still working on it. I am still months away. How many? Good question. I still have good days and bad days, and that's all I care to say. Whether Winds or the first volume of Fire and Blood will be the first to hit the bookstores is hard to say at this juncture, but I do think you will have a Westeros book for me in 2018, and who knows, maybe two. A boy can dream. Obviously, Winds did not come out in 2017. Days turned into weeks, then months, and 2017 came to an end. April 2018 is our first update of the year. In an article about Fire and Blood, George straight up says Winds will not be coming in 2018. But don't worry, you can return to Westeros with a stuffy fake history book. In an article months later in November, we get some more information on the struggles that George was, and I suppose still is, facing. Quote, "The Winds of Winter is not so much a novel as a dozen novels, each with a different protagonist, each having a different cast of supporting characters, antagonists, allies, and lovers around them, and all of these weaving together against the march of time in an extremely complex fashion, so it's very, very challenging." And that was all for 2018. You'll notice some years are far more sparse than others. It's just the way George works, I guess. Anyway, it's 2019, a new year, and Game of Thrones is on its final season. So far, I've only briefly mentioned the show, but now we have to discuss it as it relates to Winds. For those of you who watched it, you may remember the ending was terrible, and later became one of the most infamous endings in television show history. Now, I won't go into detail about every problem of the show, that's for a different video. But needless to say, people became worried that the ending of the books would be bad too, which prompted George to release a blog saying the ending would be different, or as he put it, "Winter is coming, I told you long ago, and so it is. The Winds of Winter is very late, I know, but it will be done. I won't say when. I've tried that before, only to burn you all and jinx myself. But I will finish it, and then will come A Dream of Spring." How will it end, I hear people asking? The same ending as the show? Different? Well, yes, and no. And yes, and no, and yes, and no, and yes. Needless to say, some things will be the same, other things will be very different. There was also this odd rumor around the time, started by the Barristan Selmy actor, who claimed that George had written both books and was waiting for the show to end before releasing them. Obviously, this wasn't true, and George himself would dispel it. But of all the news of 2019, the most interesting, and of course the one that has aged the worst, was George's promise. You see, in May, George said that if he didn't have Winds of Winter finished by Worldcon 2020, then his fans could, quote, imprison me in a small cabin on White Island overlooking that lake of sulfuric acid until I'm done. Winds of Winter was not finished in 2020. In October of 2019, keeping with his promise from earlier in the year, George said he wouldn't be doing any writing for the House of the Dragon show until Winds itself was done. And that October update was the last one we got for the year, so now it's time to move on to 2020. 2020 was an odd year, full of historical events, chief among them a disease that spread around the world. For most people, it was a pretty bad year, but for George, it was a great year because it forced him to stay home and also removed many of his distractions. In March, he said, "I'm spending more time in Westeros than in the real world, writing every day. Things are pretty grim in the Seven Kingdoms, but maybe not as grim as they may become here." And later in June, George also said, "If nothing else, the enforced isolation has helped me write. I am spending long hours every day on the Winds of Winter and making steady progress. I finished a new chapter yesterday, another one 3 days ago, and another one in the previous week. But no, this does not mean that the book will be finished tomorrow or published next week. It's going to be a huge book, and I still have a long way to go. Of late, I have been visiting with Cersei, Asha, Tyrion, Ser Barristan, and Areo Hotah. I will be dropping back into Bravos next week. I have bad days which get me down, and good days which lift me up. But all in all, I am pleased with the way things are doing. I do wish they would go faster, of course. Way back in 1999, when I was deep into the writing of A Storm of Swords, I was averaging about 150 pages of manuscript a month. I fear I shall never recapture that pace again. Looking back, I am not sure how I did it then. Before long, 2020 was over, and a new year began. In February of 2021, George released a blog post discussing 2020, but of most interest to us, Winds of Winter. In his words, 2020 had been the most productive year for the book ever. Quote, "I wrote hundreds and hundreds of pages of the Winds of Winter in 2020. The best year I've had on Winds ever since I began it. Why? I don't know. Maybe the isolation, or maybe I just got on a roll. Sometimes I do get on a roll. I need to keep rolling though. I still have hundreds of more pages to write to bring the novel to a satisfactory conclusion. That's what 2021 is for, I hope. I will make no predictions on when I will finish. Every time I do, assholes on the internet take that as a promise and then wait eagerly to crucify me when I miss the deadline. All I will say is that I am hopeful. For so many years, people have been wondering what's been taking so long. And no doubt, constant distractions like television shows weren't helping. Neither did the fact that Winds is set to be a highly complicated novel with lots of plot lines to either end or to make massive gains to close them out in Dream. But there's also the thought that George might not have been making a serious effort to attempt to finish the novel for years. We know that when the show caught up to the books, George lost the wind in his sails to finish the book in a timely manner. A feeling that must have surely been made worse by the fact that only 3 years later, people hated the ending of the final season, with plenty of people critiquing plot points that are probably in Dream of Spring, like Bran being king or Dany going mad. It's pretty easy to see that at some point George might have quietly given up on seriously finishing the book for a couple years at least. I do think this theory is made far more likely by the fact that he only finished Tyrion's story in 2022. And as of 2020, he was still writing Cersei chapters, Barristan chapters, and Areo Hotah chapters. But theorizing aside, it was a great year for George, at least in writing terms.
I don't want it.
From 2021, now it's on to 2022, and once again, there's some good news. In March, George confirmed he was still working on the book, but said that he had made less progress in 2021 than 2020, but less progress was apparently not none. In April, George would give a passing mention to Winds, saying it'll be a big book, possibly the biggest book in the series. In July, George once again mentions that his ending will contain differences but also similarities to the ending of the show. As he says, "What I have noticed more and more as of late, however, is my gardening is taking me further and further away from the television series. Yes, some of the things you saw on HBO and Game of Thrones you will also see in The Winds of Winter, though maybe not in quite the same ways, but much of the rest will be quite different. And really, when you think about it, this was inevitable. The novels are much bigger and much more complex than the series. Certain things that happen on HBO will not happen in the books, and vice versa. I have viewpoint characters in the books never seen on the show. Victorian Greyjoy, Arion Martell, Ario Hota, John Connington, Aaron Damphair, they all have chapters, and the things they do and say will impact the story and the major characters who are on the show. I have legions of secondary characters, not POVs, but nonetheless important to the plot, who will also figure in the story. Lady Stoneheart, Young Griff, the Tattered Prince, Penny, Brown Van Plum, the Shave Pate, Marwyn the Mage, Darkstar, Jane Westerling. Some characters you saw on the show are quite different than the versions in the novels. Yara Greyjoy is not Asha Greyjoy, and HBO's Euron Greyjoy is way different from mine.
The finger in the bum.
Quaithe still has a part to play, so does Rickon Stark, and poor Jane Poole, and, well, the list is long. And all of this is part of why Winds is taking so long. This is hard, guys. Oh, and there will be new characters as well. No new viewpoints, I promise you that. But with all these journeys and battles and scheming to come, inevitably our major players will be encountering new people in lands far and near. One thing I can say in general enough terms that I will not be spoiling anything, not all of the characters who survived until the end of Game of Thrones will survive until the end of A Song of Ice and Fire. And not all of the characters who died on Game of Thrones will die in A Song of Ice and Fire. Some will, sure, of course, maybe most, but definitely not all. Of course, I could change my mind next week with the next chapter I write. That's gardening. And the ending? You will need to wait until I get there. Some things change, a lot will not. In August, after attending Comic-Con, George unfortunately would catch COVID, so he returns home, where he confirms he'll be working on the Winds of Winter.
And that after this quarantine period, I will, be able to resume and do a few things at the tail end, and then head on back to Santa Fe to catch up on all the emails and resume work on the Winds of Winter and my numerous other projects.
At this point, if you are well acquainted with Winds of Winter updates, you know I've been beating around the bush a bit, because 2022 contained by far the biggest updates for Winds ever, even more, in my humble opinion, than 2020. This is because, in October, on two separate occasions, George revealed that Winds was 3/4 done. First in a Penguin Q&A, and then later during an interview on The Colbert Show.
Dance with Dragons and Storm of Swords are the two largest books in the series. They were both about 1,500 manuscript pages. I think this one is going to be longer than that by the time I finish it, and I think I'm about 3/4 of the way done, maybe. And I think I'm about 3/4 of the way done.
If the Winds of Winter manuscript is in similar size to the Dance with Dragons manuscript, which was 1,510 pages, then George only had a few hundred pages to go. This was later confirmed in December when George said he had around 1,100 to 1,200 pages written and about 400 to 500 pages to go. Keep in mind that George tends to only count pages he feels are done, so by 2022 there was a huge chunk of Winds written and ready to go. With that massive update that included page numbers, let's let 2022 end and move onwards to 2023, which was, in its own way, another year of news. In April, while discussing the live-action adaptation of Dunk and Egg, George discusses finishing the Dunk and Egg stories, but not until Winds is done, followed by either Fire and Blood Volume 2 or Dream of Spring. In May 2023, the writer's strike begins, stopping development of all Union TV shows. George assures everyone in a blog that this strike will not affect work on Winds, and it continues to be his top priority. July would bring another update. In a blog, George would say, "I've been working on Winds of Winter almost every day. Writing, rewriting, editing, writing some more, making steady progress. Not as fast as I would like, certainly not as fast as you would like, but progress nonetheless." Despite that, later months of 2023 brought a disappointing reveal. George admitted that the amount of pages written were the same as last year's number, meaning that George must have hit another roadblock of some kind. What in particular, we don't know.
I have like 1,100 pages written, but I still have 100 more pages to go. It's a big mother of a book.
I should also point out this interview just spawned a whole slew of discussions on the subreddit. This was because people heard George say 100 pages. Now, obviously, he was misspeaking. That was an accident. He meant to say hundreds. But that didn't stop people thinking the book would be out, next month because there's only 100 pages. It got so bad that someone performed a spectral analysis to see if he said 100 or hundreds. In all fairness to people, he actually did say 100, but it was clearly an accident. He meant to say hundreds. To round off the year, George also met with his British publishers, where they discussed many things, including Winds of Winter. This naturally set off a flurry of rumors, but as George has stated before, any Winds of Winter announcement will come clearly and direct, and there will be no clues or games. Still, it must have been a good sign that they talked about Winds, right? This leads us into 2024, which started relatively silent for Winds at least. It seems this period of time was rather depressing for George, as reflected in this blog post, which discusses both world tragedies and personal loss. From there, months would pass in silence, at least in terms of Winds of Winter, as has happened so many times before. Despite that, rumors began to build once more, as they do every other year, that George would announce Winds was done at Worldcon. This rumor was built on a web of copium and circumstantial evidence, which kept building and building and building until it was eventually noticed by George, which then resulted in a downer of a blog where George said this: "Last year, when I mentioned seeing my Voyager editor in London, the internet went nuts, throwing up all sorts of theories about how this meant that Winds of Winter was done and a huge announcement was at hand." Sorry guys, but no. That's not how it works. Making contacts, which often turn into friendships, is a huge part of publishing. Most of my communication with my editors and publishers is conducted via emails, phone calls, Zooms, and texts. In the old days, we had letters written on paper too. There's not a lot of face-to-face, especially when we're talking about people who live across an ocean, so when I travel, if I have a day or two to catch up with one of my editors or agents, I jump on it. Every time I travel to New York City, I get together with my literary agents and my editors at Bantam and Tor, along with old friends, family, and the like. That's true everywhere I go. If I fly to Germany for a con or book fair, I will see my German agents, publishers, and translators. If it's Italy or Spain or Finland, same thing. If I ever find myself in Brazil or Japan or Egypt, I try and connect with my Brazilian or Japanese or Egyptian publishers. This is just the standard way of doing business, guys. It does not signify that some momentous announcement is at hand. It doesn't signify anything actually, except a desire to touch base, catch up, renew old contacts, or make some new ones. So calm down please. When Winds of Winter is done, the word will not trickle out. There will be a big announcement. When and where, I cannot say. Way to kill the mood, George. Kidding. Kind of. I know that this blog references the editor visit, but the timing is too perfect. There really was this good week or two when Wind's copium was building up to a ridiculous level, and people really thought that George would announce at Worldcon in some epic announcement. And that's the latest update as of me recording this. We've gone through over 13 years worth of history. Since we've caught up, I want to dedicate a quick segment to discussing what we know about the book in concrete terms, or at least as concrete as they can get. Some of this has already been mentioned, but I'm just going to lay it out all here. For one, we know that Winds of Winter will either be one of or the longest book in the series. George has never revealed exact page numbers, just giving general estimates, but he has repeatedly emphasized the size and complexity of the book.
I have like 1,100 pages written.
POV-wise, we know the story will feature Tyrion, Theon, Sansa, Cersei, Asha, Aeron, Hota, Arianne, Arya, Barristan Selmy, and Victarion. Bran is unsurprisingly going to appear in Winds, but hasn't been confirmed to have a POV chapter, though he probably will have some. The prologue is set to be Jane Westerling. If you've read these books, you know the prologue and epilogue characters tend to die, so don't expect Jane to last long. Arya and Gendry will reunite, and Tyrion will finally meet Daenerys. But as we know, that latter meeting will probably take place towards the end of the novel, as George has said previously that Tyrion and Dany will spend much of the book apart. We'll also be seeing more of the Sand Snakes, expect Lady Stoneheart as well, as George claims she'll be important to Winds, and along with Lady Stoneheart, Robb's will apparently be resolved. Of the 4 battles that'll take place in Winds of Winter, we know at least 2 of them will be on screen, the Battle of Meereen and the Battle at the Ice Lake. In 2011 at Worldcon, George claimed that the Battle of Steel, which is Aegon's storming of Storm's End, was originally going to take place off-screen, but he had now changed his mind, and now the battle would be on-screen. From end-of-episode discussions in the book Fire Cannot Kill the Dragon, we know that Shireen will be burned by Stannis. We also know that the Hodor twist is in the books, and that Bran ends up sitting on the Iron Throne, though that last one will probably be in A Dream of Spring rather than Winds of Winter. And that's it. For over a decade, we've been waiting for the continuation of this series, wondering if Jon will ever return, or if Stannis will survive his battle, or Barristan his, or wondering if Aegon will at least briefly sit the Iron Throne, or what Howland Reed is up to, or if Jon Con will survive his grayscale, and so many other questions, plotlines, and theories that need to be answered. I hope one day Winds of Winter releases. News in recent years has been pretty optimistic, and it sounds like George only has a couple hundred pages left. If that's all true, maybe we'll get the book in the next few years. Hopefully sooner rather than later. But until that moment, this has been the complete history of Winds of Winter. Thank you for watching.